I think what we might do first is just a quick set of introductions across the panel. So if you'd like to go first, Keith.
So I'm Keith Ashby. I'm Head of Governance and Risk at Independence Group.
Hi, my name's John Wellborn. I'm the CEO and Managing Director of Resolute Mining Limited. Resolute currently operate two gold mines, the Ravenswood Gold Mine in North Queensland and Syama Gold Mine in the south of Mali. So although we was introduced as returning to Australia, we do have some Australian operations, but we're also very much focused on power solutions in Africa.
I'm Justin Brown, Executive Director of Element 25. We're developing a very large manganese project in Western Australia at pre-feasibility study stage at the moment.
Vincent Algar from Australian Vanadium Limited. We're developing the Gabonintha project in just south of Mikithera and currently in a pre-feasibility study stage.
And James Kerning from Goldfields, Electrical Operations Manager for the Australian region. We've got 8 operating mines around the world, 1 under construction. 4 of those are here in Western Australia.
Thanks very much, guys. Now, James, I'm going to start with you. Quick question and probably an easier one. What was the announcement yesterday with the Greco?
Thanks, mate. I suppose it's better get it off the table now. Yeah, so we've been working with the Greco for quite a few years. We've got an operating power plant now, Granny Smith Mine, and just yesterday we've announced a 7 megawatt solar project with a 2 megawatt battery, which will intend on commence operations towards the end of next year. Granny Smith is a growing underground mine at Wallaby and is using more and more power as it gets deeper, so we're going to supplement that with solar this time around.
Perfect. Thanks very much, James. I think what I'd add to that is Aggreko is currently in the final stages of commissioning our first solar diesel power station, which is in Eritrea. It's with a Canadian gold miner called Nevsun, and that's a 7 megawatt solar fixed array power station with a 22 megawatt diesel station sitting behind it. So there's no battery storage in that one. So as I said, that one is nearing the end of its commissioning stage, so we're very excited about that as well. So, on to the more important stuff, the questions. And I think I'll throw this across to everyone. I'll throw them all across to everyone, actually. So, first question is, how are mid-tier mines changing their energy supply strategies in order to reduce costs?
I'll jump in right at the start.
Thanks, Keith.
So I'd like to come at it in 2 ways. In terms of strategy, one, it's informed by our response to the market. We've all got a concern about prices, and we're getting very clear signals from our customers about what it is they want from us and how they're responding. And then the other part is, of course, how we look to optimise and maximise our business. So as a business, we're completely sold on the prospect that we're going to see a radical reduction in the cost of energy production in the long term as a consequence of improving technologies around both renewables and in the space of battery technology. That's a given, and as a consequence we're seeing a huge amount of investment in that space by other parties. So whereas in the past an organisation like ours, which has been focused on delivering nickel and copper, and that's how we've marketed ourselves and dealt with our, related to our shareholders, we're now seeing a new group of investors come to market who are interested in this broader scope. We are now seeing the suppliers of, or manufacturers of batteries coming to companies like ours directly looking to have off-take agreements. So that's one aspect that's influenced our strategy. The other one is around the way in which we manage our business. And if I look at that, of course, we're concerned both with the way we manage demand. So what we're seeing increasingly, and we're not unique in this space, of course, is the drive to automisation and particularly the electrification of business. So if you're an underground miner, I can see the time will come in the not too distant future where we'll be applying a lot of effort in that space. The other factor, of course, is really around the supply. And for a business like us, the economics are increasingly forcing us down the road of a hybrid response, and I've taken up more than my time, so I'll stop.
Oh, no, go ahead. No, that was fantastic.
I think that's very relevant. The key way that mid-cap miners like Resolute are changing their strategy is to have one. I think previously a lot of mid-cap miners in the energy space have a very simple solution: is there a grid? Can we tap into it? What price are we going to be mandated or have to cop to connect to that power, or are we going to self-perform a diesel-fired power station? That historically has been the case. I mean, Resolute, over 25 years of continuous gold production, we've run 9 different gold mines in Australia and Africa, and that's really been our journey in relation to energy. So the fact that there's this group of people in this entire conference which is focused is an indication of what's happening to the strategy, not just of the major miners, but now smaller miners and not even mid-cap miners, recognising the complexity and the opportunity around technology across the mining space, and particularly in energy. And so that means that we have to, one, have a strategy, and that strategy, as denominated in the question, is about ultimately not renewables and not even technology. It is, as the question says, how do we get the lowest cost power we can possibly get, factoring in the risk and the sustainability of that power. That's certainly our focus, and we're doing a lot of work, and the content of this conference is fascinating for us.
Thanks very much. Anyone else?
Just going into a feasibility study and starting to look more detail at the underlying cost issues that you've got to put on the table. The previous speaker mentioned it from Hatch: get in early, don't leave it on the table. And we've seen at AVL we've created a subsidiary sales company looking at the vanadium flow battery market to grow it as a potential source for offtake for vanadium, where vanadium will be used. And in so doing, we've learnt a lot about people's energy problems.
Yep.
And then that reflects back on us as we're doing the development of the operation. And as we look through that, we see that there's all these places where you will say no and go back to traditional source, pretty much like we saw in the previous presentation. But there'll be places where you go, yeah, we've got to work a bit harder to bring it in, but bring it in early. Will it make a difference to the cost? Is that critical to us? Absolutely. So now we're in this perfect situation where we've got a battery metal that is our product. It's also a steel metal, and we've also got an opportunity to look at where things like renewable generation can start to, and batteries can bring that cost of generation down or not, but make sure we do it early. And can it have an effect? Will it have an effect on the outside community and the investor community? Absolutely.
Yeah, we're looking to produce high-purity manganese from our resource at Butcherbird, which is south of Numen. We've got an interesting and perhaps somewhat unique situation in that we have a bitumen highway going through the project, we have a gas pipeline going through the project, and we're in a part of WA which has got fantastic solar and wind resources. So the approach that we're kind of taking is to start with a blank sheet at the start of the project, and that allows us to really test the market as to where renewables are at in terms of integrating renewables with traditional, probably gas power supply. And we've got another feather in our cap that we can actually engineer our plant to utilise that energy as efficiently as possible. And one of the things about renewables that I've seen here today is that the electrons from renewables over the longer term are cheaper. We have a very large resource, therefore we're unconstrained from a mine life point of view, so we can do long-term contracts. And we have all the options on the table, and we can really test the market where it's at. And I think the other thing I'd add is that the marketing advantage of products that are produced with renewables, I think in certain sectors is going to be important as time goes on, as will the impact of any carbon tax that might come in. So we're going to look at all that and hopefully get the best bang for our buck.
James?
Yeah, I'll go back to the strategy discussion where this kicked off. Goldfields of not just seeking the lowest cost of energy today, we're seeking other targets around our energy. Not just the cost, but the carbon emissions attached to that energy. So when we go out looking for our energy supplies, our scope has changed in what we're seeking from the market, and it brings a whole heap of new complexity at the beginning, but a lot of new exciting products that we're able to look at as well.
Thanks very much. And I think that leads on nicely to the next question, which relates to internal processes. So in terms of considering new energy options at your mines and processing facilities, what internal processes do you tend to follow?
Oh look, I mean we're going through an independent power provider international tender for our Syama mine, looking at options, but it's a dual track process where we're also running an internal study around a self-perform improvement opportunity. Ultimately, I think something that we're building in Resolute, and in fact is a challenge for the entire mining industry, specifically gold miners, is we're seeking to have greater capital allocation discipline. So ultimately, the answer to your question is we need to review any opportunities around the capital efficiency and the allocation of capital to that opportunity. So when you think about the power space, where in our IPP, we're obviously looking for the opportunity of a third-party financed power provider, as opposed to self-perform where we'd put capital into it. It's an interesting internal process to evaluate those two, and from a risk point of view, from a cost point of view, and they're the key drivers for us, those two elements.
Very good. Keith?
I guess the thing I would add is internally at IGO we've introduced processes such that people have to address specific factors in the consideration of capital allocation. So, for the first time ever now we are thinking and looking at potential carbon price, for example.
Yeah, we've engaged external consultants at this stage at Vizian who specialise in advising companies on renewable energy and energy solutions in general. So I guess what we're going to do is build up a base case on gas only, which we know is available to us, and then we're going to look at utilising as high penetration of renewables on top of that as we can. So we're outsourcing that issue at the moment. Obviously, the capital strategy will be to get an IPP to... We're a small company, obviously. We've got a capital hurdle to get over to get the project into production. So moving that capital for the power solution onto an IPP's balance sheet at a lower cost will be probably the right way for us.
I think you're in a good part of the world to look at IPP. It's quite a competitive market here in West Australia. James is laughing there. Yeah. Come and have a chat with us first, though.
We're in a very open situation in that we don't have the benefit of having a gas pipeline anywhere near us. That's good and bad in the sense that it's a cost we have to deal with, but it also means we have to think laterally and work with the consultants we can. It's good to come to a conference like this where we've got a lot of people that can see that and come and talk to us and start a dialogue, because we think it's a pretty competitive field in a number of different ways, where players on both the renewable side and the independent power provider side can come talk to us. One of the main reasons why we were interested in this conference and the organisers for having that discussion, opening a dialogue for people like ourselves who are developing projects and don't want to go down the traditional route or feel the traditional route is actually in the past now, which is where we are.
I think there's a fair amount of innovation within the IPP space that's out there. Like, for a Greco, traditionally a rental company, we sort of market ourselves now as a flexible IPP. So what that means is that we can redeploy our equipment from a mine site back into our fleet and then bring it back into the mine site, if required. And I know other IPPs have financing options and different things that they can offer. So I think that competition is driving innovation within the IPP side, and very much IPPs needing to get involved in that renewable energy side and battery side. For us, we bought a battery storage company, and hopefully we'll have our second battery and solar project off the ground in the not too distant future.
If I can jump in, Matt.
Yeah.
James, you mentioned earlier that part of Goldfields assessment, so the question about internal process is not just on cost or capital, it's actually on the sustainability, renewability, some level of environmental assessment. I'm genuinely interested as to how that actually works internally in terms of a very high-level assessment of a particular solution. You're saying that you'll disregard cost and capital if something's has a lower carbon footprint and or positive environmental impact, and if so, how does Goldfields evaluate that, and what benefit is it bringing to shareholders?
Yes, so this goes to our targets, and usually it's followed up by where feasible, so it's always a financial discussion. But we start our security plans looking at risk, or energy security plans looking at risk. Then we look at our mandated targets for renewable energy, and when we do our study work, we sort of cover off on those bases in those discussions. It still comes down to a business case financially, and it just seems to be that at this point in time and from this point forward, renewable energy sits on the right side of the business case.
Yeah, I'll also chip in there. We're confronted with exactly the same questions, and at the end of the day, the factors other than price are the determinants where you've got options which are close in price. So.
Yeah. Yes, we'd all like to have environmentally positive solutions. I mean, I often joke to our guys that, at one level, it'd be great if we could power the mine with 100,000 Malian nationals on bicycles, generating power and putting it in a renewable battery, and wonderful. But in the end, we can only look at that solution if it's cost competitive and it's capital efficient. And that's the challenge for the industry, for mid-cap miners or any miner or any user, is the technology and the renewable technology advancing to a point that it becomes economic, and that's obviously the obvious journey.
We hadn't considered the bicycle.
Well, there's an idea. Someone can work on it. No one's come back to me on it yet.
Very good. All right, so moving on, how are you factoring in diesel price risk into your future power plants? So we've seen the diesel price move up. With electric vehicles, we may see the diesel price come down as well. So how are you sort of looking at taking that into account?
Obviously, we'd like to reduce our diesel price risk. So I know that this morning some of the bigger miners, the iron ore industry in Western Australia, their exposure to diesel prices is claimed to be less than 5%. So at Syama in Mali, our biggest operation, it's actually 15 to 20%. We're running an open cut mining fleet. We're now moving underground, and we have a 28 megawatt diesel-fired power station. So we're very reliant, very focused on diesel price risk, and it's one of the assessment criteria, obviously, that we'd like to reduce and look at other solutions, and most obviously renewables, if for no other reason they reduce that risk. Historically, we've had access to diesel at prices, in the range of 60 US cents in Mali. So when it's a different equation in that particular market. But personally, I have a view that underground mining, which is where we're going at Syama, is going automated and it's going electric, and it's the reality of the industry. That creates an opportunity and a challenge for the power industry to match that increasing demand. That our ultimate answer as to how we're managing diesel price risk is looking at any opportunity we can to reduce our exposure to diesel. Look for electric solutions and look for alternative power that's cost efficient.
Ditto.
I think that applies to gas too, Matt, because I think the gas forecast trends in WA at least are heading up over the next sort of period. Renewables is probably trending down year on year, and obviously gives you certainty over your pricing in the future. So I think that's equally applicable to gas.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point.
Yeah. Diesel's a problem for us, mostly in our mining fleet, not in our power gen, but we've got the same issues. So we're underground miners, and diesel's got particulates associated with it as well. So we're looking at all our options to replace diesel. But there's no point generating electricity from diesel on the surface to put in an electric truck to put underground. So we're also trying to match renewable energy with our mining fleet.
Tell that to the people who buy a Tesla and power it from a brown coal fire station in Victoria. Agreed, 100%.
I think the solution there is to charge if you're going to use a battery that's different, that's charged from renewables only. So that's your way around it. If you're going to charge your underground fleet, if you can do so from a reasonable battery that's going to be efficient at doing that sort of thing, that's maybe the way to do it. That's why we're interested in vanadium flow batteries.
I think from the movement in price of batteries over the last little while, and with the talk of the number of factories that are going in to produce batteries in China, the number of lithium mines that we sort of saw this morning, and other battery-related mines that are going in, I think there's very positive signs around battery prices continuing that trajectory further down. So hopefully that's the case going forward.
Yeah, but I think that creates a challenge for miners, and particularly mid-cap miners. I equate it to a little bit like in the early stages of laptops, where if you'd wait a month, you'll get a much better model, lower cost, bigger memory, and it's a real reluctance to make the acquisition because it's getting better and better. So I think one of the reasons why miners particularly are looking at solar is that the technology has advanced to a point where the rate of change doesn't look to be so rapid that you're going to be left behind if you make that decision. Batteries, we'd love to go with battery underground automated equipment, we're going with tethered electric equipment and diesel haulage because that's our assessment of where that technology is at. So you're right that there's huge opportunity and signs of progress, but for miners it's difficult to make decisions along long mine lives around access to that technology while it's changing so rapidly.
Yeah,
improving.
There's a perverse disincentive there, to invest in batteries at the moment. So to hold off. Which actually leads on to our next question. What are the particular challenges that mid-tier miners face, when they're considering, different power options?
Well, we've heard it a number of times, and I'll be telling nothing new. But for us, it's really down to life of asset.
Yep.
We all aspire to having long life, massive mines. But the fact of the matter is, most of us would be described as mid-tier are dealing with life of mines which are relatively short and often sub 10 years. So then it comes to how you justify the application of that capital. And, we've been looking at this right from the inception of our Nova project, and it still remains a challenge, even with the recent increases in diesel prices. So watch the space.
Anyone else want to have a crack at that one?
Yeah, the life of mine's been a similar problem for us. We've made a lot of short-term investment decisions in the past, and we're trying to change that, and we're trying to make some longer-term decisions now in the future. There's some risk associated with that, which we have to understand, and we're doing that through exploration and investment. But there's a whole heap of other variables which we need to try and keep a handle on as well. So there's rising and falling energy prices, there's the potential for a carbon tax, new carbon tax, there's LGC prices which are variable, and there's plenty of risks that we are trying to understand in making those decisions. And what helps make those decisions is having a longer view of the operation. So I think we've got to take that longer view, and the words mentioned this morning was take a leap of faith. We've got to consider that to be an option, not a risk that we want to take, but is there a benefit in taking that leap of faith in the long run? Otherwise, in the short run, obviously we're going to end up with a higher price, but in the long run, take that leap of faith, and the benefits are a lot higher with the energy price.
I attended a conference here 2 weeks ago. Interesting question for you on that. It's a very fundamental mining thing. The guy said to us, it was an IT conference, talking about IT infrastructure and taking leaps into the IT space. Similar problem really. You're making decisions on hardware and automation, and the guy said to us, why don't you make these leaps in mining? All the other industries are doing it. Nuba's got it, and everyone else has got it. Why don't we do it? And I said it's because of that fundamental unknowing of the resource. We don't know the resource well enough for long enough to be comfortable to make those decisions that we make. So the resource is unknowable, and because of that, we don't know. We're not a factory. We don't know this stuff. So so it comes back to a fundamental thing about our resource knowledge, ironically.
Consequently, we fall into the trap of short-term thinking. There's a flip side of that. I agree with you entirely. But instead of blaming myself, I blame my investors. I think the mining industry generally, although conferences like this and increasingly the mining space, we're seeing automation and IT and all of these great things, and CEOs like myself will stand up and talk about how we're at the cutting edge, or in fact often try and indicate that we're adopting proven technology to make our mines better. But ultimately, if I stand up and say we're doing something for the first time and we think it's going to work, and we're taking, if I start telling everyone that goldfields are taking leaps of faith all the time, their investors will run for the door. No one wants me to stand up and say we've come up with we're backing someone who's built a new battery and it's going to power our whole mine, and we're putting in an automated battery-powered machine that no one's used underground. It just reads risk. So the flip side of that about the mining industry, it's all about managing risk. We're out hunt. You've got to find the stuff. You've got to dig it up. It's getting increasingly difficult. You've got to sell it where your revenue line is never certain. Your resource is never certain. There's so much uncertainty. So we seek, and our investors seek, certainty. In the technology space, that makes it very difficult to innovate, and no one really talks about that challenge. So I think that's really relevant. I mean, the other challenge that we discussed in some part earlier is be really understanding what your drivers are and what your responsibilities are. I think there's a really big one that must come through in conferences like this, which is, as a CEO of a mining company, what's my responsibility for my carbon footprint, for my renewable energy mandate, for the sort of targets that Goldfields have set themselves, and do my shareholders want me to be focused on making the planet better, or do they want me to get gold out of the ground? Ultimately, we want to obviously, and the challenge, particularly in the energy space, is to line those two things. And obviously what we're trying to do is recognise that the right thing to do for business is always the right thing to do, and make sure that those two things align. But in a rapidly changing technology space, that's difficult, and that's why we still see coal-fired power stations in operation and in some parts of the world growing. And that's a big challenge for making the right energy decision.
I think if it's a simple sort of electricity solution, I think I would argue that renewables are a little more mature than that, just in the sense that there's been a number of large-scale renewable sort of plants operating for some time. I think the mining industry is probably lagging a little bit, would be my view, and I think you're sort of seeing recently, and obviously evidenced by the number of people here, that we're starting to sort of wake up and perhaps even drink the Kool-Aid a little bit in places, but it's obviously horses for courses depending where you're at. And if it suits, it suits, but it shouldn't be discarded, I guess, just because it's perceived as perhaps high risk, because I think that might be past us now.
Yeah, I'd just like to chip in though, to talk about price sensitivity to life of mine. And we've clearly done a lot of work on this. A year can make all the difference. So if I say, I've got a life of mine and I publish the resource, if it's 8 years versus 9 years, that in of itself could be the determinant on the decision. It's that subtle.
I think also when you're looking at the sharing of risk between the miner and the power supplier, looking at bleeding edge technology, and then if you're a miner, saying to your shareholders, look, we've got a PPA in place and there's liquidated damages sort of within the PPA. The point that is sort of well understood by miners and power suppliers is that the liquidated damages don't cover the potential production losses at the mines. So there is a sharing of risk between the supplier and the off-taker, but it's not all of the risk that's there. The miner still has production risk which isn't entirely covered by the PPA. What I also wanted to sort of ask as part of this was, we have seen significant government assistance over the past little while for remote mining and remote mining projects. But of late, government groups have tended to back away a little bit from providing that assistance. Do you think the assistance that has been provided has been enough, or do you think that there still needs to be sort of further sort of investment from the government in remote mining opportunities, similar to what we've seen at say Weipa and De Grassa, to help offset the perceived risks that miners sort of see in moving to renewable generation?
I'll probably be lynched, but I think it's important that the government's involved in the early stages of these things, and if they're effectively going to subsidise business to get key projects off the ground to demonstrate proof of concept, that's a great thing. But in the long term, we can't expect ongoing subsidy. And the key thing that we've seen change in the last few years is that projects that were non-viable without subsidy now are marginal or close to being a goer without subsidy. And that's all about the cost of technology dropping.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure I agree. It depends where you think the industry's going, and also the maturity of the jurisdiction. So if you think about Africa, I think there's a huge incentive for the government to support independent power, whether that's independent power run by a miner or by a third party, because the agenda of the government is actually to establish a grid and provide power, and so anyone investing in power should be supported, and it actually justifies a subsidy. I think it's different in a more mature environment like Australia, where, but even in Australia, the concept, it comes back to the first question about changing strategies. That decision of a miner to tap into power on a grid or produce their own, the advent of renewables and independent funding for power solutions, and potentially variable length offtake from miners, even right down to the household level where you put a solar panel on the roof, it creates this opportunity where you may be putting power back into the grid from the infrastructure that you build. And so where a miner has a reserve life of 7 years, but in order to build a renewable power station, he needs an offtake of 20. I think that's a great argument with where a government, if there's a power need in the area, we're not middle of nowhere, or there's a possible future power, well, that's where I think a subsidy and or the support for that long-term offtake from a government, and particularly an African government, makes a lot of sense.
I think we shouldn't be looking at the subsidy to give miners a lower cost of energy, because we're sure the taxpayers' money doesn't need to help out the miners, but where the subsidy is helpful is with the technology risk. And when we're off-grid, we tend to over-invest in enabling technologies in our power plants, either it's in redundancy or it's in a bigger battery or something like that. The idea of the subsidy is to enable that technology for the first few projects and help us understand the technical risk. I think there's value in the subsidy at the moment until a few more projects have been commercialised and we're able to see those projects operating successfully and reliably. Those technologies are still going to need investment, and subsidies helpful for that.
I think I see the role of government as really much involved in creating that environment, and whether it be a physical environment in terms of an infrastructure layout they can be involved in, or help the utilities to be involved in. When you've got an area that's developing, and just take our project for example, we stuck between Sandstone, Mikithera and Yalgu and Kew, and there's 4 diesel-fired power stations in all 4 of those towns, and there's no gas pipeline that services any of them. Now, they're 130 kilometres this way and that way. Now, there's an opportunity for the government to get involved with extending its gas network to cover that area. There's a lot of gold mines in that area. There's probably a lot of other potential resources in that area. And I heard someone say earlier, I think the Goldfields councillor, I don't know where he is, he was talking earlier today about putting power down the line of the ore body that we know about, because that'll allow those ore bodies to be developed. It's very similar in the region that we work in, and there's probably a lot of other regions that we've got there. And the Pilbara is another example. To help let the government help us develop infrastructure so that we can develop the mines, and they'll swing or not swing on their own ability to run the mines. At least they've got something to work with, which is a long-term thing and a job thing as well for them.
Yeah, I broadly agree. I don't think the government should be just giving free handouts, but I think targeted subsidies are useful when there's ancillary benefits, as Vince is describing, for towns around the development or whatever, and also for getting new technologies going. I think, similar to an R&D type rebate, to encourage people to do research on new technologies. I think the same sort of logic should be applied to renewable energy and regional development.
Very good. All right. So let's move on to carbon pricing. So I was just wanting to ask the group, just in terms of like attributing a price, to carbon within projects when you're assessing a project. Do any of your groups use like a shadow carbon price in any way?
No.
No, not yet.
No.
So, yes.
I think that's pretty resounding.
So I guess I came out of the Western Mining School, and so Western Mining were doing it back in the late 90s, and as a state of the play, things have not moved on. So whereas, say, the majors have been looking at it for the last 20 years, or we still do it. We don't expend a lot of resources on it, but we've just got to watch and brief. If this thing ever rears its head again, what does it look like for us? So it's not like there's a lot of money invested in this thing, but we do maintain a view.
Can I just ask the guys that are operating in Western Australia, do you use, what variables do you use on your diesel rebates? Do you modify those or run sensitivities on your diesel rebate costs?
No, we just tend to look at hedging our diesel out further, so locking in our commodity price rather than looking at the rebate. But what I'll say about carbon pricing is we don't put it into our financial models as a decision-making tool, but we look to it as a risk. So in our energy security plans, we look at the potential of a carbon price coming in, and then look at how we're going to mitigate those costs by investing in certain technologies.
Very good. All right. Well, we're nearly at the end here. I just wanted to ask the panel, in terms of preferred business models for investing in renewable energy, I think we've touched on this a little bit already, but it sounds very much like in the mid-tier area, it's more the use of an IPPs capital as opposed to going down the path of engaging a consultant and doing an EPC type build for this sort of infrastructure. Would that be correct?
Well, as I described it, that's the exact decision tree that we're working on in looking at a new solution. And so most obviously, if there's a zero or low capital solution that's going to provide you low cost power, and the risk elements of that provision of that power and the potential contract related risk is manageable, then that's an ideal solution. But it is that trade-off between having control, the deliverability of that, and the ability to have the confidence and capability of actually signing an off-take long enough to really get the benefit of that arrangement. Is the obvious business model. So the answer to your question is the reason Resolute are running a dual track process is we'd love to obviously avoid having to put capital into a lower cost solution. The reason we're running a self-perform option is that we recognise that the most appropriate solution might be to deploy capital ourselves from a perspective.
Keith?
I guess we were already wedded to a solution with an existing provider. And really now it's just a case of whether the economics stack up or not on that particular project.
Yeah, I think in Element 25's case, it's pretty clear cut. We're a fairly small company trying to get a big project up and running. We've got a mine life that's 20, 30, 50, 60 years long, potentially. And so we can enter into those long-term contracts and obviously move that capital onto the balance sheet of someone who can get it much cheaper than we can.
I think WA's got a lot of competitive players in. As you mentioned before, they're starting to look at the renewable angle, so I think you'll judge them on what their views are. But you negotiate hard and get the best deal you can. If you're starting up, you don't want to be starting with a price that's going to kill you. So, and look to the guys around us here who've done it before and ask them who to avoid and who to talk to.
Yeah, make sure you come and talk to me. Last question here. So in terms of your mining power portfolio, how do you expect it to change over the next, I suppose, 3 to 5 to 10 years? So, we've seen, predominantly diesel move across to gas, over the past, 10 to 20 years with the pipelines that have sort of been put in, and now you have this transition sort of, more to renewables. Do you, feel fairly confident that we'll see sort of this sort of broad move across to renewables sort of happen over the next 3 to 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I'm prepared to bet my house that in the next 10 years it will become the norm that we see hybrid solutions at remote mine sites.
Yeah, and I think the real kicker to that is the storage capacity equation, and that's not just the mining industry. I think that's every power user, and that seems obvious. It has to become a reality. The big change, I think, over the next 3 to 5 years is increasingly miners, big, small, and otherwise, will develop strategies, and there will be champions. There's actually a number of case studies already. I'm sure we've just heard from one. There'll be lots at this conference, but I think in 3 to 5 years you'll have an amazing array of examples of success stories, and they'll lead to greater opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable. I think the cost of installing these hybrid solutions is trending down. You can't say that about other alternatives. It'll be case by case to a large extent, but I think it'll become much more normal than it has been in the past.
Yeah, the drivers of displacing higher energy intensities, you just can't do it with more thermal generation anymore. So we're looking at offsetting those energy intensities with renewable energy in the next 3 to 5 years. And in the longer term, we'd like to think that gas and diesel are now transition fuels, and with enabling technologies and storage becoming more viable, then in the future we'd like to move further and further away from thermal and towards renewable energy.
And I think on that note, we'll wrap things up. So thank you very much.